7 continents, 1 world. Bringing you the latest in international news from the WRHU studio in Hempstead, New York on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org. This is Around the World in 30 minutes with Eli Finkelson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, to keep you updated on the world around you. Our top stories this evening: several resignations. Austrian Health Minister Rudolf Anschaber has chosen to resign from his position, largely due to exhaustion. Throughout the pandemic, Anschaber has been struggling with high blood pressure, as well as circulation and blood sugar issues. In addition to these ailments, death threats forced Anschaber to go under police protection last November. These events combined forced him to resign. His successor will be Wolfgang Muckstein, a trained Austrian doctor and a member of the same political party as Anschaber. Anschaber's farewell speech served as warning against stigmatizing those with health issues. Austrian President Alexander Van der Bellen thanked Anschaber for his service, both personally and on behalf of the Austrian people. And Haiti's prime minister resigned early on April 14th in the wake of mass killings and kidnappings, a referendum, and a general election this year. Joseph Jouty has been Prime Minister of Haiti since March 2020 and has come under fire several times as Haiti is continuously overrun by poverty, natural disasters, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Jouty tried to resign several months ago, but President Jovenel Moïse refused to accept it. Minister Claude Joseph has been named interim Prime Minister for the time before the election. In Iran, thousands of centrifuges were destroyed or damaged at the Natanz nuclear center in what the country says was a deliberate attack. The head of the Iranian Parliament's research center says the facility no longer has the capability to enrich uranium after the incident. Iran has blamed Israel for the attack, calling it an act of, quote, nuclear sabotage. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif says Iran will take revenge and that they already have identified the perpetrator. After the damage, Iran announced it would be increasing the quality of nuclear enrichment at other facilities from 20% to 60%, significantly higher than the level set in the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran and the United States will be holding indirect talks in Vienna to address nuclear enrichment and the possible lifting of economic sanctions. 11 members of a German far-right terrorist organization are being tried for planning to carry out attacks on Muslims, migrants, and politicians. The men were allegedly connected to Group S, a German neo-Nazi military group. They allegedly had access to 27 unlicensed weapons and were allegedly planning on obtaining an AK-47 style rifle with 2,000 rounds of ammunition, as well as an Uzi. The group has been active since 2019, and after informants alerted the police to the group's intentions, 13 arrests were made in 2020. One militant died in pretrial custody. The group's links to other German far-right groups are also being investigated. Peru's presidential election was held on April 11th, with Pedro Castillo taking a lead in votes against challenger Keiko Fujimori, daughter of former President Alberto Fujimori, who faces allegations of corruption. Of the 96% of the votes that have been counted, Castillo leads with 19%, while Fujimori has 13%, according to Peru's electoral officials. Both candidates did not meet the simple majority required to win the first round that includes 18 contenders. The runoff vote is expected to be held on June 6th. And according to the Defense Ministry of Taiwan, a record number of Chinese military jets flew into its air defense zone on April 13th. With 25 aircrafts, including fighters and nuclear-capable bombers, the incursion is said to be the largest in a year. The Defense Ministry said that combat aircrafts were deployed to warn the Chinese jets as a response. The tensions arise as Taiwan views itself as a sovereign state, in contrast to Beijing, that sees it as a breakaway province. The incident came a day after the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken expressed concerns about China's, quote, increasingly aggressive actions towards Taiwan. And a boat has capsized off the coast of Djibouti, leaving over a dozen dead. According to the International Organization for Migration, the boat was operated by, quote, people smugglers and was carrying 60 migrants fleeing for safety in Yemen. The cause of the incident is unclear, but 34 people have died as a result. The IOM has raised concerns over this event as it is the second of its kind this month. And Ethiopia has claimed to have resolved all disputes over their Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam. The GRED has raised disputes from neighboring Egypt and Sudan as they fear the dam will be detrimental to their sections of the Nile River. The Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs tweeted, quote, Ethiopia has addressed all of the concerns of #Sudan on #GRED as they're technical. Data exchange has been offered, and dam safety is an issue that's well taken care of by Ethiopia for its own safety in the first place. Despite this, Sudan and Egypt continue to heighten rhetoric against the dam. This comes after talk over the dam fell apart earlier this month. Tropical cyclone Seroja made landfall in Western Australia, causing significant damage. The Category 3 storm smashed houses, knocked down trees, and caused power outages in the town of Kalbarri. Emergency services say up to 70% of structures in the small town were damaged by the cyclone. Australian weather authorities say Seroja maintained uncommon strength as it moved inland towards the region known as the Wheat Belt. Emergency services say they had to respond to nearly 200 calls for help during the storm. The Australian government is now offering emergency funds to the affected residents of the state. And President Jovenel Moïse of Haiti says he will do what it takes to release 10 people who were kidnapped by a gang in the town of Croix des Bouquets on April 11th. Of the 10 people kidnapped, 3 are Catholic clergy, along with a French nun and priest who were attacked on their way to the ceremony of a new parish priest. According to someone familiar with the situation, the kidnappers have asked for $1 million in ransom. Police officials suspect a local gang to be behind the kidnapping. And an uplifting story, according to the recent census, the number of one-horned rhinos in Nepal's wildlife sanctuaries has increased by more than 100. The population, which was at 645 rhinos in just 2015, has increased to 752. Nepal is one of the few countries where greater one-horned rhinos can still be found. Efforts to revive the population from near extinction in Nepal and India have been said to be successful, and the rhino status has been improved from endangered to vulnerable. Experts say the coronavirus pandemic helped the revival as animals could wander freely in the sanctuaries without the presence of tourists. And now for our continuing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the latest coronavirus stories and numbers from around the world, let's go to WRHU reporter Conor Donnelly. Conor?
Thank you, Eli. Good evening, everyone. I'm Conor Donnelly with your COVID-19 World Outlook. Across the United Kingdom, shops, salons, and pubs reopened with crowds gathering for midnight entry events. Cases have sharply declined in the country due to a combination of stricter lockdown measures and a successful vaccine rollout. So far, nearly half of the United Kingdom has received at least one dose of the vaccine. The 7-day average for new cases in the United Kingdom has been just above 2,000. Denmark has fully paused the rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine over concerns related to rare cases of blood clots. While other European countries had previously temporarily paused injections, all have so far resumed its use. Germany is planning to pass new legislation allowing the federal government to override the states when creating new restrictions. So far, all 16 state premiers have expressed support for the plan. Compulsory restriction measures would be enacted when states hit a certain infection rate, and lifted as soon as they cross back under that rate. In Latin America, Brazil's daily death toll from COVID surpassed 4,000 for the first time this week. The country has been struggling to contain the spread of COVID variants with little coordination between the states on lockdown measures. Brazil has purchased enough doses to cover the country's population, but production queues mean the majority of them will not be delivered until late 2021. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador told reporters he would not personally take a COVID-19 vaccine. While he had originally planned to receive it, he says doctors informed him he had sufficient antibodies from his infection with COVID in January. Mexico has experienced 200,000 deaths from COVID, but government officials say the real toll could be as high as 320,000. In the Middle East, Iran is imposing a 10-day lockdown as daily cases surge to over 20,000. The rise in infection comes on the tail of the Persian New Year, where millions of Iranians traveled for vacation and congregated in homes. Despite the approval of several domestic vaccines and the import of new doses under the COVAX scheme, Iran has only been able to vaccinate 200,000 citizens so far. The death total in Iran has crossed 63,000. Egyptian health advisor Noha Assem says the country would likely face a third wave beginning with the month of Ramadan. He says the prevention of the third wave will depend on citizens' commitment to avoid public gatherings and follow social distancing measures during the holy month. Daily cases have been rising in Egypt in recent weeks, with numbers averaging around 700. In Asia, the director of the Chinese Center for Disease Control, Gao Fu, publicly acknowledged the lower efficacy of Chinese-created vaccines in comparison with other options. The efficacy of the 5 approved Chinese vaccines ranges from 50 to 80%, while the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines have around 95%. Fu says his comments have been largely taken out of context, saying he was expressing a desire to explore mRNA-related vaccine technologies in the future. India is currently struggling to contain large crowds as the country struggles with a second wave. The Hindu holiday of Kumbh Mela has drawn millions of faithful to make a ceremonial trip to the Ganges River. This week, India surpassed Brazil for total cases at 13.5 million. The vaccine rollout has been swift in India, with over 100 million doses administered so far, but production has slowed in recent days. And in Africa, the World Health Organization has said the rollout of COVID vaccines across the continent has been hampered by supply shortages and delays. WHO Regional Director for Africa, Matshidiso Moeti, says more than 1 billion Africans have not been given any access to even a single dose of the vaccine. She says the unequal distribution of vaccines to poor nations is concerning and hopes the COVAX plan will begin hitting its targets. She says making sure all regions have access is important in the prevention of new and dangerous COVID variants. In Mozambique, 4 people were arrested for producing fake COVID-19 testing certificates displaying negative results. 3 of the suspects were government health workers who allegedly sold the tests which individuals used to cross the border into South Africa. For Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm Conor Donnelly. Back to you, Eli.
Thank you, Connor, for that report. For those of you just joining us, you're tuned in to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. We now move to our special report tonight with Crystal Bermudez.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Crystal Bermudez with your special report. In Mexico, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador says he plans to visit the southern border of Mexico to put an end of the smuggling of child migrants. The announcement comes days after the United States government asked Mexico and Central American countries to reduce the number of child migrants arriving at the border using troops. López Obrador showed photographs during a press conference of a tractor-trailer rig stopped in the city of Tuxtla Gutiérrez that was carrying 149 child migrants. The director of Mexico's Child and Family Protection Agency says they will move from Mexico City to Tapachula until the numbers decrease. Ongoing volcanic eruptions on April 14th left remains buried under ashes on the island of St. Vincent. The National Emergency Management Organization for St. Vincent and the Grenadines announced on Facebook that explosions and ashfall of similar or larger magnitude will continue in the incoming days. Local residents were forced to evacuate their homes that sit right outside of the red zone. The eruptions began last week, with ash spreading throughout all over St. Vincent and reaching parts of Barbados and Grenadines. Didier Tribic, United Nations resident coordinator for Eastern Caribbean, says this is a humanitarian crisis, as water and hygiene supply shortages combined with the pandemic challenge emergency officials. U.S. citizens visiting the Caribbean island are being advised to evacuate to St. Martin on April 16th. Boarding will begin at 7 a.m. with no cost of travel. Following the recent death of 99-year-old Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth II has returned to royal duties. According to the court circular, the Queen attended a retirement ceremony for Lord Chamberlain Earl Peel, the royal household senior official. The palace announced the members of the royal family will, quote, undertake engagements appropriate to the circumstances as they mourn. Prince Philip's funeral will take place Saturday, April 17th at the Windsor Castle, with attendance only limited to 30 people due to COVID restrictions. For Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm Crystal Bermudez.
And many may have heard of a destructive volcanic eruption this week in St. Vincent. For more on the eruption and the tens of thousands of people displaced because of it, we go to Daniel Gall.
Today I am joined by Hofstra geology professor Antonio Marcelos to discuss the significance of the volcanic eruptions which took place in St. Vincent. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It is one of those moments that they do happen very often. St. Vincent volcano is something different. Well, let's say it's very interesting because there's a long story about how media and the public collaborate in order to have an efficient and successful evacuation, and of course, no casualties during such an unpleasant event.
Right. So now you said briefly that the volcanic eruption was different. Why was this specific volcano significant?
As I mentioned, there's a story about St. Vincent's volcanic eruptions, and in 1976, everybody thought about a major explosion that may alter so much like the human evolution. They exaggerated so much the events that media capture, well, get the information from scientists, and things went uncontrolled. So 72,000 people evacuated at that time, and there was no reason for that. So there was a huge economic crisis at that time. And 3 years afterwards, a real volcanic eruption happened. Of course, people were ready at that time. And the same thing happened right now. But this time, we are prepared. We, we have satellites, we have ground monitoring techniques that they are uncomparable with 1976.
So you briefly touched upon the media and the effort to evacuate. What has been the response from the local community to the recent volcano?
Yes, the local community and the authorities were very collaborated, uh, but I have to admit, in all those events, things are not as they're prepared to. For example, no one was prepared for a COVID-19 situation at the same time with a volcanic eruption. So this kind of eruption which is an explosive eruption, just to mention, and not like a sporadic eruption that many people are getting confused between those two. Um, so this kind of explosion emits a huge amount of ash and pyroclastic debris up to thousands of feet to the sky. And we don't know how the COVID-19 spread, um, let's say, what's the role on that and how that affects. So that is the situation that St. Vincent is running right now. And they have to kind of uh, deal with two types of patients, like COVID-19 and um, issues with the respiratory system caused by the volcanic eruption. So they're both respiratorily, issues in human health, but from different sources. So they have to cope with those unprecedented times with the volcanic eruption as well.
Absolutely. So now my final question to you talks about the global climate as a whole. So over the last few years, we've had changes in temperatures and other global environments have changed, which has caused an uptick in natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and droughts, especially in the US and the surrounding areas. So is there some correlation between this trend and the Listopher eruption?
And the driving mechanism is the amount of water. The amount of water comes from melting of the ice due to the rising temperatures. So climate change, yes, it does affect those atmospheric phenomena. But the way that a volcanic eruption takes place, it originates mainly from inside of planet Earth. And of course, I wouldn't like to be misunderstood here. There are exogenic factors that may trigger such events. Like, for example, we are entering a new era of sunspots. So sunspots are going to increase and they're going to affect the way that Earth system evolves during the next couple of years. So those happen, but there's no strong scientific correlation that can say some relationship, an immediate relationship, let's say direct one.
Thanks again to Professor Antonio Marcellos for his insight. Reporting for WRHU, I'm Daniel Gall.
Now let's move to our featured topic of the week. Tens of thousands of Russian troops are on the border of Ukraine as internal conflict in the eastern regions of Ukraine rage on. I spoke with two experts on Russian-Ukrainian history and what the current conflict means for the area and the United States. First, I spoke with author and professor of political science at Rutgers University, Alexander Motyl, who specializes in the history of the era and Russian power politics. So thank you so much, Professor Motyl, for being on the show today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's my pleasure.
My first question for you, really what I would like to speak to you about right now is the history of this sort of conflict and where this is stemming from, how we got to this point, Russia's history with Ukraine specifically, because history is of course your area of expertise. So recently, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed legislation that would allow him to retain power until 2036 if elected. Is the recent troop buildup near Ukraine in any way connected to Russian domestic politics?
Well, to a certain degree, Putin has had a rocky last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
There have been mass demonstrations. There were the problems with Belarus. His popularity has declined. The economy isn't doing well. There are parliamentary elections. They're sham, but nevertheless, they will be taking place in September. And, this may be an opportunity for him to show off that he's still Tarzan. But I don't think that's the key issue, although it's probably a factor in his overall calculations.
Of course. And recently, Ukrainian President Zelensky visited troops near the front lines in the Donbass region and called Russia's actions an attempted intimidation. Is there greater meaning in going to visit the troops in person during this conflict? What do you see there?
Well, it's just an effort on his part to show that he's solidary. Remember, he's the commander-in-chief. There's a massive buildup of Russian forces on the Ukrainian border. And he needs to go and show that he's part of the guys. He supports the army. He understands the army. He's obviously playing to a domestic audience. He's also trying to convey to Ukrainians that he's a patriot, because there were some issues with that. He hasn't always been quite clear as to his attitude towards Ukrainian independence and the possibility of talking with Putin. And this is clearly a signal of support and solidarity. But again, I don't know if that's critically important. The real issue is, of course, the buildup. It's something like 80,000 troops on Ukraine's borders.
Right, which was absolutely my next question for you, which is tens of thousands of troops are on the Ukrainian border right now, which is not a small number of people. What does that suggest to you, this buildup of Russian troops?
And there again, one can only speculate because, inevitably it's a question of what's going on in Putin's head. And since he's a dictator and can more or less change his mind at will and more or less do whatever he likes, he could change his mind on a whim. He could decide to invade on a whim. He could decide to withdraw on a whim. So we don't really know. That said, when one looks at this from a kind of rational point of view and tries to determine what the underlying logic would be, then one factor obviously is that Putin has made he hasn't concealed his detestation of Ukraine and Ukraine's independence. To him, it's an obstacle. To him, it's an insult. It's simply something that he cannot possibly live with. And again, I'm not suggesting that this is in his mind. I mean, he's made this very clear. He also has a phobia when it comes to democracies, especially democratic regimes in his immediate neighborhood, because they suggest to Russians that democracy might also be possible in Russia. And he's also made no bones about having an imperialist agenda, reestablishing Russia in its pre-1917 borders. Again, this is on the record, so it's clear. None of that explains the exact timing, because these are basically background factors. And I think the more important points in terms of timing are that there are several, okay? I'll be as brief as I possibly can be. So President Zelensky of Ukraine has recently initiated a crackdown on a variety of pro-Russian oligarchs. He's also cracked down on some pro-Russian media outlets and has activated a policy of trying to generate international discussion regarding Crimea. So this may be Putin's way of saying, all right, I know what you're up to, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. This is possible. It's also possible that Putin is concerned with water supplies from Ukraine to the Crimea. Ukraine cut off the channel, or rather the canal that supplies water, and insists that it's not their problem. Summer is approaching, there is a water shortage, and this may be his way of trying to force the Ukrainians' hands when it comes to water supplies. And then there's the bigger picture. This may be a way of testing Biden. Biden is president. Biden called him a killer. Biden is talking about, well, not quite saying that he wants to make America great again, but he certainly hasn't concealed his, let's call it hostility toward Russia and to Putin. And this may be Putin's way of saying, well, let's see what, how strong are you? How tough are you after all? And then last but not least, the United States and NATO have just recently begun a fairly significant set of military exercises in Central and Eastern Europe called Defender Europe 2021, which involves something like 20 to 30 to 35,000 forces. And this is going to continue until early June, if I'm not mistaken. And there again, Putin may be saying, well, if you can do it, I can do it too. Right? So that's kind of the range of possible interpretations. Which of them is the key? It's hard to say.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, joined right now by Professor Alexander Motyl, author and professor of political science at Rutgers University. I want to go back on something you touched on just now, which is that it's an insult that Ukraine has sort of adopted democracy and is almost westernizing in that way. Can you tell us a little bit about why that would be insulting to Russia and what the history is there?
Well, the history, arguably goes back 1,000 years, but I'll spare your listeners a blow-by-blow account. But it certainly goes back several hundred years to at least the 16th, 17th centuries, if not earlier. And the Russian state and the Russian political elite, not so much the population, because they were basically benighted peasants, but the political elite and the state, as well as the Russian church, has always had difficulty accepting the legitimacy of a separate Ukrainian nation. And keep in mind that it's roughly in the 17th century, 18th century, that both in Russia, a Russian nation begins to appear, and in the territories that today comprise Ukraine, something resembling a Ukrainian nation comes to appear. And essentially, to put it somewhat starkly and oversimplified, but only just a bit, in essence, many, or let's put it this way, far too many Russians think of Ukrainians as being some kind of bogus German or Western plot. In effect, Ukrainians are really Russians, and to the degree that they insist they're not, that's because they've been bamboozled by the Western media or whoever happens to be the enemy of choice in the West. Naturally, from the Ukrainian point of view, this is at best an unacceptable position. So in any case, with the emergence of an independent Ukraine in 1991, many Russians, certainly those of that kind of imperial mindset, and including Putin, found this simply unacceptable. Right? The mere fact of an independent Ukraine suggests that 400 years of Russian history and its denial of Ukrainian existence is somehow delegitimized. And in contrast, right, this whole enterprise, this thing called Ukrainian independence, Ukrainian statehood, is totally artificial, has no reason to exist. And it's high time that the Ukrainians finally got it into their heads and rejoined the fold of Mother Russia. And then, to complicate things even more, to add insult to injury, these stupid Ukrainians have the audacity to try to be democratic. Now, the democracy in Ukraine, sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, but it's still basically a democratic country, certainly in comparison to many of its neighbors. And Putin, of course, has invested 20 years of his life insisting that the only road for Russia's development is authoritarianism. And here you've got these upstart Ukrainians more or less succeeding in establishing a more or less stable and more or less well-functioning democratic state. That is a threat, an insult, and it simply cannot be tolerated. And if it were just Putin, that might be his hang-up. But it's a significant portion of the Russian political elite that has these sorts of views. And of course, they formed the background. I mean, I don't know if they were the immediate cause for the buildup this week or next week, but they formed the background that helps to make it more understandable as to why Putin, he gets apoplectic about Ukraine.
And I'm sure to add insult to injury, Ukraine is now asking NATO to speed up the process and is asking for access to become a member state of NATO. Do you think that prompted some of Russia's actions?
Well, again, they've only been talking about this, and Ukrainians have been talking about joining NATO for 30 years, and their chances of actually joining NATO anytime soon are pretty much close to zero. And the Russians know this. I mean, the Russians aren't stupid. They've got their spies in NATO headquarters, so they know exactly what the discussions inside NATO are. They've got their spies inside Kiev, so they know exactly what the Ukrainians are up to as well. The irony of all of this is that the more Putin presses Ukraine and the more he resorts to aggression and coercion, the more Ukrainians, the Ukrainian population, becomes persuaded that its only way to establish security is by going towards NATO. In a way, you see, Putin is pursuing a completely irrational and counterproductive policy. If he wanted Ukraine not to join NATO or not to aspire to join NATO, he should practice a good neighbor policy. But instead of speaking softly, all he does is wave big sticks. And sooner or later, many, if not most Ukrainians are getting on the NATO bandwagon. Now, as I said, now it's up to NATO actually to admit Ukraine, and that's not going to happen for a long time. And everybody knows that. And I'm pretty sure Putin knows that too.
And speaking of NATO, several member states have now spoken out against Russia putting troops on the Ukrainian border. The most recent of which was this morning when Germany's defense minister said that neither NATO nor Ukraine would be pulled into Russia's game. She called it a game. What do you think she meant by that?
Well, clearly it's a statement of NATO's concern. Or of Germany's concern, right? So it's concern and let's call it a certain kind of uncertain support for Ukrainian independence. It's a roundabout way of stating that. Very German in that particular regard, rather than simply coming out and saying, we support the Ukrainians and we don't like you, Mr. Putin. They're talking about not being drawn into a particular game. I think the game she has in mind is this game of intimidation. And we're not going to let ourselves be intimidated, is the message that she presumably is conveying to Mr. Putin. What's equally interesting than these sort of along with these particular signals, is that there is now serious discussion in Washington, Brussels, as well as in many of the capitals of Europe, of the kind of policies that should be adopted today, or at least announced today, so as to deter Putin from crossing any particular red lines. So there's talk of halting the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or perhaps deactivating it altogether should Russia actually invade. There's talk of imposing far more severe sanctions, which would really cripple the economy. There's talk of delinking Russia from the so-called SWIFT system, which would basically isolate it from the system of transactions that take place in the world. And of course, the United States has been more than just hinting that should there be an invasion, the United States would supply significant amounts of offensive and defensive weapons to Ukraine. And again, everybody's hoping that it doesn't come to this. But the idea behind this, as well as the idea behind the statement in Germany, is to remind Putin to bring to his attention that should he do something this foolhardy, there would be enormously painful consequences to deal with. The West will not simply sit on its hands and do nothing.
For those of you just tuning in, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, joined right now talking about the Ukraine-Russia conflict with Professor Alexander Motyl, author and professor of political science at Rutgers University. Now, you've mentioned several things that I want to touch on in my next question, which is, several NATO states have now spoken out. President Biden has said that there will be consequences, but we've also all got this sort of unspoken understanding that Ukraine will not be joining NATO and therefore will not be in any form of entangling alliance that would require any of the NATO states to go to war on behalf of Ukraine should Russian troops move in. My question for you is, there are so many different ways that this could play out in terms of if Russia were to move forward. What do you think is the most likely scenario, though?
Well, assuming a full-scale invasion, right? That's what you're asking.
Correct.
It would turn into a bloody mess, obviously for Ukraine, but also for Russia. Compare Ukraine's position today with its position in 2014, when Russia was also on the verge of invading. Ukraine then had an army consisting of 7,000 battle-hardened troops. Now its army is over 200,000, and these are soldiers who've had actual combat experience as a result of the war in eastern Ukraine. It's built up its armaments industry, so these soldiers are armed, they're trained, they're numerous, they're dedicated. There's also a very significant volunteer movement in Ukraine, which played a very important role in 2014. And these individuals who are not in the formal army would certainly join the fray. Ukraine has its own equivalents of javelins. It's also gotten some javelin anti-tank weapons from the United States. Its air force is minimal, right? But it does have the capacity. My point is, it does have the capacity, especially given the determination of its soldiers to defend the homeland. The Ukrainian army does have the capacity to make any kind of full-scale attack by the Russians a very painful proposition. The Ukrainians will fight, and they will probably fight to the finish because they have no choice. I mean, basically, Putin would be putting their backs against the wall, and in that position, you really have no choice but to fight. It's either be killed by Putin or die trying to resist. Again, I don't want to over-dramatize things, but again, assuming this is the scenario, this is what would happen. Putin would also have to consider that in his attack from the east, south, or north, he would be killing a civilian population that is largely Russian-speaking and that he considers to be Russians. There's no way of getting around that, because that civilian population is precisely the people whom he believes have been most bamboozled by Ukrainians and others. So he would have to justify not only to his political elite, but ultimately to the Russian population, why he's killing Russians. Now, if this were to be a protracted fight, presumably the Russians would win. But then there's the next question. How do you deal with the subsequent guerrilla activity? Because that would take place. So you would need to have an enormous occupation army, probably around 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers who would have to occupy one half, if not more, of Ukraine. This would be an enormous expenditure, an enormous distraction. And then keep in mind that Russians would be returning in body bags. And we're not talking about tens or hundreds, more likely thousands, if not tens of thousands. So it would be a mess, as I said. It would be a tragedy. It would be a mess. It would be a catastrophe. More likely than not, there would be ethnic cleansing, possibly genocide, certainly war crimes committed. Again, for Putin to embark upon this, he would have to be, well, crazy.
So you don't think that that's likely?
Well, I don't think it's likely, but then again, I'm not sure about Putin. There's that Putin factor because he's been a serial bumbler. When it comes to Ukraine, he's basically done everything wrong over the last 30 years. So he has a long record of doing stupid things with regard to Ukraine. So given that record, there's no reason not to think he couldn't repeat it.
The Putin factor, you should coin that. So my next question is sort of two questions, and we've talked a little bit about President Biden, his stance on that. He's calling for a summit meeting with President Putin to discuss things, Ukraine being one of them. But my question for you is, and we talk about this a lot on the show, which is that Americans inherently don't typically care about things going on abroad, understanding that right now there's a lot going on domestically, but traditionally Americans tend to turn a blind eye to what's going on internationally. So in this regard, why should Americans care what's going on at the Ukrainian border right now?
Well, Ukraine is far away. That's absolutely true. And Americans certainly have more than enough to do at home. That's also certainly true. And in a way, with the question you're asking, why should Americans care about anything relating to foreign policy?
Correct.
And there are a number of reasons. I mean, let's start with the humanitarian one. Namely, we are talking about potentially tens of thousands of people being killed on both sides, and not just soldiers, but civilians primarily. So we're talking about a potential humanitarian catastrophe. We may be talking about a very likely a wave of refugees, certainly from Ukraine, but possibly from some of the border regions of Russia, escaping into Europe and other parts of the Eurasian continent. So that alone should elicit some degree of concern. And as you know, Ukraine has a very diverse population. So we're not just talking about ethnic Ukrainians. There are also Russian Ukrainians, there are Jewish Ukrainians, Polish Ukrainians, Hungarian Ukrainians, Tatar Ukrainians, and others. So this begins to send out ripples into a variety of countries and a variety of regions. So people should be concerned for that reason. And then, of course, the larger issue, but it's one that I grant you, it's not an immediate issue for most Americans because it concerns foreign policy, is that a war like this would mean the end of the post-war security architecture, certainly in Europe, arguably in the world. It would mean that countries could start wars with impunity, could change borders with impunity, could commit atrocities with impunity. And the reason why that matters is that if the Russians can get away with that in Ukraine, then in all likelihood, other countries will realize that this is a model that they might be able to follow in their particular backyards. China, for instance, comes to mind. They might be emboldened to try something vis-a-vis Taiwan or in the South China Sea. And many other countries, the list is long. Many other countries that have grievances regarding ethnic minorities or borders or things of that sort. And then once this becomes a larger problem, it expands beyond borders of Ukraine, then that will immediately have an impact on America because our interests are throughout the entire world. And sooner or later, soldiers from the United States would be sent somewhere. Maybe not to Ukraine, possibly to Taiwan. Maybe not to Taiwan, possibly to South Korea. So in a way, Ukraine is kind of the harbinger potentially of things to come. If it turns into a bloody war, then we're all in extremely serious trouble. If alternatively war doesn't happen, then that also has positive ripple effects. That may affect perceptions in Beijing and Pyongyang, and other continents as well.
What an interesting and dangerous precedent we're sort of watching unfold right now. Professor, is there anything else? I know we've covered a lot of different topics over the last 20 or so minutes. Is there anything else that you think is pertinent to add, either about the history of the conflict, what's happening right now, or things to come?
Well, in terms of the history, let me just add a few words here, because I talked about going back 1,000 years. But the last 20 years under Putin have been the critical ones, of course. And there are many reasons, some going back 1,000 years, some going back 300, some going back 20 or 30. But the key reasons really are, at least as far as I'm concerned, really concern Mr. Putin and his transformation of a more or less democratic Russia into a profoundly, deeply violent and aggressive authoritarian state with himself as dictator. This is the most important point to keep in mind. He's invested 20 plus years of his life in this project. He thinks that it's contributed to making Russia great again. In reality, what it's probably done is guaranteed Russia's weakness and possible collapse if and when Putin finally leaves the historical stage. But it's part and parcel of his strategy of keeping in power and maintaining some degree of legitimacy to maintain tensions with his neighbors. He needs to maintain his hegemony and Russian hegemony in the area that was part of the former Soviet Union. He needs to be able to show in this Tarzan-like style that he can still beat his chest and yodel loudly. And that's imperative for him. If that doesn't work, his legitimacy suffers and his standing within Russia suffers as well. So the bad news is that so much of this is centered on the personality of Putin, and to some degree he's a cipher. The good news is that Putin is not eternal. And sooner or later, as with all of us, right, he will not be here to bother us, to bother Russia, and to bother Ukraine and Russia's many other neighbors as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Motyl, for coming on the show this afternoon. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure, Ms. Finkelson.
Next, I turn to our own backyard to speak with Hofstra political science professor Dr. Paul Fritz, who specializes in Russian politics, international relations, and nuclear warfare. Dr. Paul Fritz of Hofstra University Political Science Department, thank you so much for being on the show this afternoon. Could you just start by giving us a little bit of information, some background on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine's eastern regions, how it relates to Russia, some general background?
Sure, absolutely. So first, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me. This conflict goes back to 2014, maybe even further than that, but sort of the real issues that we're seeing today date back to then, when Russia surprisingly and sort of out of the blue annexed Crimea. And then after that, we've seen sort of this long simmering war in eastern Ukraine, specifically in the Donbass region, which is heavily ethnic Russian. And Russia has been supporting ethnic Russian separatists in that region for quite a while. It's been it said it's simmering, but it's a fairly intense conflict where about 14,000 people have died, according to the Ukrainian government, excuse me. So what we've seen is this, from 2014 on, this big border dispute, essentially, between Russia and Ukraine. So that's sort of the short version of it. And what happened most recently, about 2 weeks ago, Russia started to flood the area with thousands and thousands of troops and military equipment, some of it very concerning, some of it including short-range ballistic missiles, some long-range artillery, and other sorts of things that would be used in another military operation, potentially against Ukraine. So this buildup has caused alarm, obviously, in Ukraine. Ukraine is no military match for Russia, so this sort of buildup is a huge threat to Ukraine. And the West has responded as it's a potential threat as well. NATO has called on Russia to back off. The United States has essentially called on Russia to back off as well. Russia has, claimed that this is in defense of their interest and that this has been something that was in response to provocations by NATO expansion and placing more NATO troops in former Soviet states. And they also claim it's just a normal military exercise, but it's a very, very tense situation right now.
Now, Russia has amassed tens of thousands of troops at the Ukrainian border, right? That's not a small sum of people. And of course, as you said, they've claimed that this is in defense of their interests. But as somebody with a doctorate in this, what does that suggest to you?
You know, it's really hard to know right now. But what it suggests to me in thinking about sort of Russian past foreign policy behavior, that this is, you know, most likely an effort to throw everybody off in some ways, to sow some chaos, if you will, right? We've seen that this is a pattern for Vladimir Putin in particular. We saw this with the interfering in the 2016 presidential election, where the goal was, yes, to help Donald Trump, but mostly to sow chaos within the US political system. We've seen this with other foreign policy actions in Russia in the past several years, where it's to keep the world off balance, if you will, and to make sure that everybody knows that Russia is still around and that it still is a major power with a lot of interest that it's going to defend, especially in what it calls the near abroad, the former Soviet states. So I think that we can look at this most recent troop buildup as potentially in this pattern where in the US, we have a new president who's claimed that he's going to be much tougher on Russia than what the previous president was. President Biden, in fact, called Putin a killer in an interview, and has tried to stake out a policy that appears that it's going to be much tougher on Russia. So this could be, the Russian actions now could be a reminder to the US that Russia still has the capability to cause problems, especially in the former Soviet space, and that the US maybe shouldn't push too hard. So it could be a signal there. Now, whether it is or not, it's hard to tell. It fits a pattern with Russian foreign policy behavior, but the whole thing is that Russian foreign policy behavior is intended to be a bit unpredictable. So we'll see.
And before we move on to the future and United States sort of reactions to this and different NATO reactions, I want to talk about a little bit of history, right? Because you've brought up some really good points. Fighting in the Donbass region is not new. That's been on and off with ceasefires for the last several years now. Does this increased Russian military presence mean anything for those ceasefires?
I think it makes it more difficult to have a true, meaningful ceasefire. I mean, what we're seeing is that this could give a lot of comfort and aid, essentially, to the Russian separatists within the Donbass region. Certainly, what could happen is that there could be quick reinforcements given some estimates around 80,000 troops that have moved very close to the region. And we know in the past that Russian military forces have been active in that region too, helping the separatists. They've not been in Russian military uniforms, and they've tried to hide this to some extent. But it certainly could make it a situation where some of the separatists are more emboldened. And we've seen a little bit of increase, according to Ukraine, we've seen some increased military contact within that region in the past week or so, with a Ukrainian soldier being killed, I believe was a report from Ukraine. So it's already an extraordinarily tenuous situation before the Russian troop deployment a couple weeks ago, and adding this in only makes it all the more filled with tension.
For those of you just joining us, you're tuned into Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, joined right now by Dr. Paul Fritz, professor of political science at Hofstra University, discussing the conflict in and around Ukraine right now. I want to move on to sort of future and what's going on right now. I mean, several NATO countries have spoken out as recently as this morning, with Germany for the second time this week, urging Russia to pull back their troops. What does it mean that so many powerful countries are speaking out against Russia right now?
I think that the West is providing sort of a united front in this case, much like was done in 2014 when Russia annexed Ukraine. But there's an issue here. So we have Germany, we have other major NATO powers, including the US, coming together to form a broad coalition to threaten that there could be severe consequences for Russia if there's further action taken. The problem is that for NATO, for the US, for Germany, for others, there's limited ability to influence Russia. If Russia would decide that military action in this region is in its interest, additional sanctions or other things may not deter Russia, because Russia knows, and I think NATO leaders know, that NATO is not going to get into a war over Ukraine with Russia. That's simply off the table. NATO is not going to welcome Ukraine into the alliance either, especially with Russian provocations, because NATO as a collective security organization has to defend all of its members. Ukraine really, really would like to be a NATO member, but it's simply not going to happen anytime soon. So there's limited ability for the West to do much. Now, that said, economic sanctions can still hurt Russia if something occurs, right? And that's still an if. We don't know if it's going to. But in the end, there's limited ability to shape Russian behavior here.
So if it's sort of almost all talk and no action, then what is the purpose of all of these countries speaking out against it?
Well, I think one is to define Russia as the bad actor here, and to make sure that the Russian narrative is sort of drowned out with the narrative that the West wants. And I think that's the more accurate one. I mean, Russia is the aggressor here. And that's important in some ways, because the UN Security Council, for example, is not going to be able to do anything about this because of the Russian veto on the Security Council. And China is unwilling to speak out against Russia in this instance. So the West needs to come together to sort of define the problem, if you will. Other than that, sort of one thing to keep in mind is that some of this is about internal NATO politics as well. So we have Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, the Baltic states, former Soviet states, not to mention Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and others that were in the Eastern Bloc. But certainly the Baltic states in particular are right on the Russian border and suffer provocations from Russia every once in a while. And NATO needs to reassure those members in particular that it's doing enough to deter Russian aggression, or that's the hope, that it's deterring Russian aggression. So standing strong on Ukraine, or at least rhetorically standing strong on Ukraine, can help with internal alliance cohesion and reassure those members of NATO that are threatened most directly by Russia.
I suppose it probably should have been my first question, but why Ukraine? Why is this the area that Russia seems so keen on controlling?
Yeah, so this is a good question. It's a long, tortured history between Russia and Ukraine, of course. And I won't go into that, but most recently, in sort of what we've seen that's probably driving most of this, is that Ukraine has sort of shifted to the westward orientation. It wasn't always the case. We've seen former Ukrainian presidents that were very close to Moscow. But the newest president is very clearly with Western orientation. Western Ukraine is very much tied to the rest of Europe. There's a divide in Ukrainian society for sure between East and West. But Ukraine is a rather large state, right on the border of Russia. Russia has always sort of thought of Ukraine as a place where it should legitimately have a lot of influence. Losing that influence in Ukraine to the West has been a sore spot for Russia well before Vladimir Putin even entered the presidential office. I mean, this was an issue to some extent with Boris Yeltsin, as the first president of the Russian Federation. So I would, that's the context, but it would also add that Ukraine as a non-NATO state with no alliances to protect it it's relatively easy pickings for Russia in some ways. Ukraine is weak compared to Russia. So, with that historical legacy, with the opportunities coming up, and not to mention sort of Russian need to distract from domestic issues in some ways, having a foreign conflict, having a foreign source of national unity, if you will, around this potential issue, which elicits a lot of Russian nationalism, might work in Russia's favor in some ways, or at least it's seen as it's calculated to be something that would help the regime in Russia.
And President Biden recently asked for a meeting with President Putin to discuss a whole slew of things, this just being one of the things on the docket. And, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said something similar, urging Putin to pull back. Putin has denied any sort of relations to new troops being put at the border. But you've said that it's a matter of fact that NATO is not going to war over Ukraine. That's not even an option. What do you think it would take for NATO to declare war with Russia?
I think it would have to be an actual Russian incursion into an existing NATO state. Ukraine is important to the West. Ukraine is a state that the West would like to bring in more fully into its orbit. But the interest in Ukraine and the value of Ukraine is simply not high enough to go to war with a nuclear armed state. And the thing is, Russia knows this as well, and Russia can push and push and push and keep it below the level of escalation where there would have to be some sort of military response. And Russia knows that it can do this. I mean, in 2014, annexing Crimea, that was the first territorial annexation in Europe since 1945, right? Since World War II. And the worst that came out of it were economic sanctions. So I think that it's a very well-established sort of parameter of this relationship that, yes, NATO, the United States, other Western countries are going to support Ukraine as long as it doesn't draw it into a conflict with Russia, an open conflict with Russia.
Now, you've done a lot of research on nuclear weapons. That's one of the things that you specialize in, is research in nuclear weapons. Not to alarm anyone that would necessarily be the next go-to step in this conflict. But do you see the potential for nuclear warfare in the future at any point of this conflict?
Not purposeful in any way. I think so. There's a couple things that I'll say in this regard. So nuclear weapons provide sort of an escalation lid in some ways. That's the thing that's in the back of the minds of everyone in the Biden administration, everybody in Germany, that this is potential conflict with a nuclear armed state. Mm-hmm. US and Russia have the capability to destroy each other many, many times over. So that sort of keeps a lid on potential escalation. And that might be one reason that nobody wants to take even that first step of escalation of any type of direct military conflict. Mm-hmm. That said, the worry, of course, is always that things can escalate, that if there is some sort of military action, if, say, for example, the U.S. is claiming that it's sending 2 warships to the Black Sea, which is an area that Russia considers its own, right? Now, the U.S. has the right to do this, just as Russia has the right to send submarines right off the coast of Long Island, which it does pretty often. But these kinds of interactions, and it's a possibility for miscalculations and accidents to happen. Russia has a history of literally buzzing U.S. warships with fighter jets and other things in a show, a very provocative show that, hey, we're here and this is our area. It only takes a small incident to spark what one side might see as a necessary to respond to do something, right? So when you have military forces close together, that's always the worry, is that there could be a miscalculation or an accident or a misperception of it, and it starts to spiral. And stopping a spiral when it comes to military conflict of any sorts is very difficult. Now, would it actually get to exchange of nuclear weapons? I very highly doubt it, because of the stakes that we're talking about. But you can't say it's a probability of 0. It might be very low and it might be approaching 0, but you have to ask yourself, when it comes to something as destructive as nuclear war, are you willing to what level of risk are you going to take? And most people would say it's not much of a risk you're willing to accept.
For those of you just joining us, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, right now joined with Dr. Paul Fritz, political science professor at Hofstra University, wrapping up right now talking about the conflict in Ukraine with Russia. As the expert on the subject, as the expert in this sort of conflict, how do you see this conflict playing out in the near future?
My best guess is that this is going to sort of peter out, to be quite honest. That what we'll see is Russia's going to keep up this provocation for a while. It may turn into, as you mentioned earlier, sort of when Biden offered a summit essentially with Putin. Maybe that will be something that will come out of this, and that's something that gives status to Putin and to Russia, and that's something that they very much desire. But my best guess is that Russia is going to keep pressure on, but both sides Ukraine is going to be very restrained in this. That's going to continue to seek allies and friends and support, but it's not going to do anything too provocative. And Russia might be able to get what it wants out of this by just having the troops there and not much else. So I think that that's honestly the best case scenario right now, but I also think it's pretty likely. I don't foresee any sort of huge military incursion. I think the biggest risk that we could see is sort of increased fighting by the Russian-backed separatists in the Donbass region, which could be pretty significant. We'll see. But I also I would say that that's sort of a medium risk in some ways in the near future. But for the large part, again, and maybe I'm too optimistic here, but I think that it should just sort of peter out eventually.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul Fritz, for coming on the show. I know we covered so many topics in the last 20 minutes, but is there anything else that you think is pertinent to add when it comes to anything we've discussed?
No, I don't think so in particular with this issue, but I will say sort of from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, it'll be very interesting to see how the Biden administration reacts to sort of its first foreign policy crisis. It came into office with lots of crises that it had to deal with COVID and immigration and other sorts of issues. But this is really the first foreign policy crisis. So this could be interesting to see how it plays out with other issues, say Iran, North Korea, if it decides to poke its head out anytime soon and such. So it'll give us a blueprint in some ways to see how the Biden administration is going to tackle these issues.
I would actually ask you, one of the things that we discuss on this show, Around the World in 30 Minutes, is why Americans should care about foreign policy, right? And what's going on not at home. And I know we have so many things going on domestically right now, but why should American citizens care about Russian troops in Ukraine?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And polls show over and over that Americans don't care that much about this, and they don't know much about it. For sometimes for very good reasons, as you pointed out, there's a lot going on here at home, and things have to be taken care of at home. But foreign policy has effects that we don't necessarily see directly every day. If we are talking about, say, conflict with Russia, which is a major natural gas supplier. So supplies of natural gas could be disrupted in certain areas, driving up the price that we have to pay for heating our homes. Same goes for oil, sort of those indirect effects. But sort of in a larger way too, we're kind of at an inflection point with US foreign policy. So Americans have become used to the US being the so-called leader of the Western world. That's in your lifetime the way that it's always been, for example. There's never been anything else. Well, what we're seeing is that other states are starting to catch up. Other states are starting to challenge the US in more significant ways. Russia is one of them, but China is another one. The benefits that the US has accrued as sort of the leader of the world are almost untold in a lot of ways. It's hard to measure them, the advantages that Americans have in being sort of the leader of the world in terms of the economy and structuring the international political economy and other sorts of things. The more that becomes challenged, the more likely the US is going to face some stiffer competition. And as an extension, American citizens are going to face stiffer competition for not just goods and things that they buy, but in terms of opportunities that we have. So sometimes it can be hard to explain the importance of foreign policy. because sometimes things are pretty well removed from individuals and their individual lives. But I can say with confidence that it affects each of us every day, even if we don't feel it every day. So thank you for that question. As a professor, that's one of my favorite things to be able to discuss.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul Fritz, for coming on the show this afternoon. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you to Professors Motyl and Fritz for that expertise. That will do it for this week's edition of Around the World in 30 Minutes. Special thank you to producer Cassidy Slamin, reporters Conor Donnelly, Crystal Bermudez, and Daniel Gall, and researchers Matt McDermott and Urvi Gandhi. I'm Eli Finkelson. Keep an eye out, America. There's more around the world than you might think.